Hey Indian Creek 8th grade students, it's Professor Blazek and I'm back with part 3 in our series on World War II. In this video we're going to be looking at American involvement. Everything we talked about so far has only had to do with Germany and their conquests in Europe and the Soviet Union and Italy, and now we're finally going to see what exactly happened that caused the United States to get involved in World War II. So during Hitler's early aggressions, America passed a series of laws that were called the Neutrality Acts. And what the Neutrality Acts did is that they banned the United States from selling weapons to countries that were involved in war, and it only allowed trade with countries who could pay cash up front. And the reason for this was that many of the debts that America had taken on during World War I had still not been paid back. And because America was still going through the Great Depression, Americans did not want to take on any additional lost money. So they said, we're going to stay out of Europe's business. We will only trade with countries who can give us the money right then and there. We don't want to take on any more debt. And we also are not going to get involved in any kind of weapons trading with these countries that are fighting, because we don't want to make enemies with the other side. You know, America wanted to stay entirely out because of what happened in World War I, because of the Great Depression. In the beginning, it was Europe's problem only. Now, despite the fact that America was still neutral, President Franklin Roosevelt did take some steps to prepare for eventually maybe having to enter into World War II. He strengthened the U.S. Navy, and he asked Congress to pass a new Neutrality Act, and this new act allowed America to actually sell weapons to warring countries. And then in 1940, he passed what is called the Selective Service and Training Act, but it is more commonly referred to as the draft, where men from the ages of 18 to 35 can get drafted into military service. This was the first time that this was ever created, was in 1940 by FDR. Now, there were a lot of Americans who did not support these steps that Roosevelt took for possibly entering into the war, because again, many Americans after World War I and still dealing with the Great Depression, they believed that America should just keep out of European problems and just worry about, getting America back to where it had been before the Great Depression had happened. Now, after President Roosevelt won re-election in 1940, and knowing that he had 4 more years as president at least, he took more steps to prepare for the United States potentially getting involved in World War II, and also because of just how much power and how much land Germany had been taking over in Europe, he knew that Hitler would eventually need to be stopped. And Stalin and Mussolini, Roosevelt knew that actions were going to be needed to prevent Europe from falling into these 3 countries' hands. So the first thing that Roosevelt did was he urged Congress to pass what was called the Lend-Lease Act. And the Lend-Lease Act allowed America to sell, lend, or lease arms, which means weapons, to countries that were at war. Now, obviously, this was designed for the Allied countries, so Great Britain and France in particular, to take advantage of. And actually, Great Britain was the first one to use this act. And then in 1941, Roosevelt joined Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and they signed the Atlantic Charter, which was not Roosevelt signing on to get involved in the war, but it was an agreement between the two that pledged that every nation would eventually be free to choose its own government and live what they called free of fear and want. So essentially, Roosevelt and Churchill were speaking out against the atrocities that these dictators like Stalin and Hitler and Mussolini had been creating in Europe. They were promising that every country would eventually be allowed to have more freedom, to choose its own government, to not have to worry about being invaded, being conquered, being led by some ruler who was just incredibly unfair and incredibly violent in their actions. And so while Germany and Italy were waging war in Europe and they were conquering all these different lands, Japan also began to expand in Asia. So Japan, as we talked about in the first video, had captured land in Manchuria and in northern China and in French Indochina. Japan badly needed certain resources like oil and rubber and other materials, resources that they didn't have the ability to produce or harvest or grow or anything like that in their own countries. And so what Japan decided was that they were going to capture the Dutch East Indies and British Malaya, which would give them the access to these materials that they badly needed, both for their economy and for their military overall. Now, because of the ties and the closeness between Great Britain and America, Japan also decided that because they were going to capture a British territory in the Pacific Ocean, they would also need to capture the American territories of the Philippines, Wake Island, and Guam. So it was basically Japan wanted to expand throughout the entire Pacific, and this was their plan of doing so. So if we look at a map here, you can see that the Japanese Empire is outlined in red, and their essential plan in taking over complete control of the Pacific Ocean was to move south from Siam and French Indochina into Malaya through the Dutch East Indies, and then this would give them access to the American territory of the Philippines. And then from Japan, they could send troops and ships all the way to Guam and then eventually to Wake. So this was the Japanese plan for how they were going to gain control of a lot of territory in the Pacific Ocean. Now, these aggressions by Japan were met by President Roosevelt freezing Japanese assets in American banks, and he also stopped selling oil, gasoline, and other resources that Japan required. So the aggression led to Roosevelt, again, because he didn't want to get involved yet. There were still a lot of Americans who were against going to war. His solution was, we're going to try and cripple their economy even further to where they either have to back off or simply just can't even continue to fight these battles because they don't have these resources. Now, this really upset Japan, as you would probably guess, and a new prime minister in Japan named Hideki Tojo actually began to plan an attack on the United States. So there's a picture of Tojo right there. Now, it's important to understand that Japan's ultimate goal was not a full military victory. They didn't want to invade the United States in any way. They didn't want to, come in to the West Coast and conquer any land or anything like that. But instead, they wanted to just be able to capture specific strategic islands in the Pacific Ocean to get the resources they need and also give them a good military standing to be able to fight off any counterattacks. And then by doing so, Japan hoped to eventually force the United States and the Allies to sign a treaty, which would allow them to keep these new territories that they had conquered. So if we go back here to the map, you can see the arrows are already on there for Japan's original plan of attack. Now, once they had carried this out, they would then move from the Philippines and Guam out into the Marshall Islands, into New Guinea, and into the Solomon Islands as well. And then by doing so, they would have essentially created this almost shield-like formation where they have complete control over a wide array of islands where it would be very difficult to capture all of the territories that Japan now occupied. Now, as we talked about, Prime Minister Tojo had been planning an attack on the United States, and it's one that I'm sure all of you have heard of. It took place on the morning of December 7th in 1941 when Japanese planes bombed the United States military base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Now, the American forces at Pearl Harbor were taken completely by surprise. There was no idea that such an attack was going to take place, and there were 15 ships and hundreds of planes destroyed, along with over 2,300 people. A lot of the military personnel, but also a number of civilians killed in these bombing attacks. Now, this was a Japanese gamble because they were hoping that this sudden attack would force the United States to negotiate, but you'll see in the long run, this gamble really did not pay off at all. Now, the attack on Pearl Harbor was devastating. It was, the worst disaster in military history. But what it did do for America is it united every single person behind entering the war. And they talk about people who had previously been protesting the war the day after Pearl Harbor were going in to sign up for the Navy or the Air Force or the Army. And so the day after Pearl Harbor, America declared war on Japan. And President Roosevelt gave a speech where he said that December 7th was a day that would live in infamy, and he was absolutely right. Now, 3 days after the United States declared war on Japan, Germany and Italy, because they were Japan's allies, declared war on the United States, and the United States answered by declaring war on them as well. So what happened was the United States would join the Allied nations, so Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, and they were fighting against the Axis powers, which were Japan, Italy, and Germany. Now, most scholars agree that declaring war on the United States by Germany and Italy in hindsight was a major, major mistake. And the reason for that is that by declaring war, what Germany did is it forced the United States to get involved in Europe, which America might not otherwise have done. Remember, America wanted to stay out of European problems. The only reason that they were getting involved in the war at this point was because they had been attacked. Japan had bombed Pearl Harbor. So, if America had only declared war on Japan, America would have only been focusing on Japan, and this would have given Germany a much greater advantage in Europe because they wouldn't have had to worry about all of the American troops who would go over there. They wouldn't have had to worry about the supplies and the reinforcements that could be sent to help Great Britain and France as well. In addition, America also wouldn't have given as much aid if they'd only been fighting Japan because American resources would have only been concentrated on fighting Japan. On top of that, coming out of the Great Depression, America had so many people who still did not have jobs, a lot of industries that had sort of been floundering and not really realizing their full potential. But you'll see that once America got involved in World War II, that really spurred American industry and the American people into putting in the time and the work and making all of the things that were required to fight the war. They really sort of, the phrase is woke a sleeping giant. And the attack on Pearl Harbor and then the declarations of war really united America and showed off just how much potential the American people had when they were united in a common goal. Now, it is possible, and some would argue even probable, that eventually the United States would have gotten involved in the war in Europe anyway, but even just the delay of a year or 2 years might have been enough time for Germany to completely control all of the lands that they were after and made it so that Germany was just unbeatable at that point. But that's something that, we'll never know because history played out a completely different way. So that's all I have for you in this video on the origins of America's involvement in World War II. I will be back soon with the next video in this series. But until then, this has been Professor Blazek, and I will see you next time.